Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and Jews for a Secular Democracy is our pluralistic social justice initiative that focuses on church-state separation issues through Jewish perspectives. And it's pluralistic. We are not um, unanimous in our approach in the Jewish community. We have multiple viewpoints. We do have consensus on many of these issues, though, that I hope that we'll be able to get into today. We're very honored to be joined by two state legislators, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your experiences and your perspectives. So thank you very much for joining us. I'll give a brief bio on the both of you. Kentucky State Representative Daniel Grossman is a Democratic
Grossberg.
freshman. Huh?
Grossberg. You said Grossman.
I'm sorry. My bio has a typo. Daniel Grossberg, I'm very sorry about that, is a Democratic freshman state representative from Louisville, Kentucky. He lives with his wife, Erica, a high school Spanish teacher, and their two rescue golden retrievers. His policy interests focus on social justice and futurism. And offline, maybe we'll talk about when you think the singularity is going to happen, because I'm interested in futurism as well. In his spare time, he likes to spend time with his family, tend to his plants, eat exotic food, and travel. He proudly represents the most diverse district in the state and is himself the only Jewish state representative. And Colorado State Senator Daphna Michaelson Janae is just finishing her 7th legislative session as a representative and is thrilled to have been elected to the Senate to continue her advocacy. Her legislative work primarily focuses on youth, particularly foster youth, mental health, and healthcare access. She ran for office primarily because of her personal experiences with her family and mental health. When her son was 9 years old, he attempted suicide at school. This has impacted her work deeply. She previously served as the director of the Holocaust Awareness Institute of the University of Denver, as well as the director of the March of the Living for the Board of Jewish Education of Greater New York. In addition, the senator was president of the Denver chapter of Hadassah. She also authored the book, It Takes a Little Crazy to Make a Difference, chronicling her experience traveling to all 50 states in one calendar year in search of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to solve problems in their communities. So thank you both very much for being here. I have a number of questions to start us off with, and if folks have questions as well who are attendees, please ask it either in the chat or the Q&A. And my colleague, Katie Ryder, who is our National Director for Jews for Secular Democracy, will be sure to track it and make sure that we get to your questions. But I have a number to kind of kick it off. And the first is, and it's touched on a little bit in your bios, can you tell us a bit about your relationship to Judaism and Jewish life? Did you grow up with it? What has your experience been as part of the Jewish community? And let's start with you, Representative Grossberg.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I have not yet written a book, and I don't intend to, so I've got to give kudos to Daphna over there. And I didn't know until reading her bio yesterday, and she and I have actually met in person, that she has written a book. So my hat's off. I don't know how someone can ever carve out the time if they're not a professional and can dedicate full time to doing that. To answer your question, I grew up largely secular, but to two Jewish parents. My father has since converted to Catholicism. My parents got divorced when I was young, and my mother got remarried to someone who is ethnically Jewish, but an atheist. So I did the absolute minimum growing up. I did just enough Hebrew school and Sunday school to do my bar mitzvah, and then that was practically it, other than some social engagements here or there. When my wife and I were dating and talking about engagement, I wanted to have a Jewish, at least Jew-ish wedding. And so I brought her to the synagogue. The rabbi told us that they were doing an Intro to Judaism class and encouraged my wife to do the class so that she could learn more about me and my culture. And I'm going to fast forward and say that she is the most Jewish non-Jew in reality now. I'm talking like she makes a mean matzo ball, can do the entire Seder dinner from memory, corrects me if I'm doing prayers wrong, can answer questions on halacha, but she's still not Jewish. But back to the story. So we're doing the Intro to Judaism class. And at the end of the class, the end of the course, I should say, because it was like 8 weeks, the rabbi asked her, so when are you going to convert? And she's like, what do you mean convert? And he's like, you did all these classes, you already know everything, why don't you convert? And yes, I'm well aware that you're not supposed to encourage conversion in Judaism, but the rabbi exerted a lot of pressure. My wife made clear, or then girlfriend made clear, she was not going to convert, especially under duress. And the rabbi told us that if that's the case, then he could no longer perform the wedding. So with very little notice, we had to scuttle that. And luckily, according to Jewish law, all it takes is 2 witnesses who are learned in Torah. So we had it performed and witnessed by some family friends who are more academic Jews. One's a sociologist, one's an anthropologist, but with extensive Jewish learning, and were able to satisfy that. So at that point, I had written off organized Judaism. I resigned from the shul, said I was never going to be involved in organized Judaism again a day in my life. And a friend of mine was pressuring me right after the wedding. Why don't you come to this Hanukkah party for the young adult division of the Jewish Community Center? I said, no, I'm done with it. Back and forth. Eventually he tells me, just come to the party, you'll meet some people. So I come to the party, and to my surprise, because at this point I'd already lived in Louisville for like 15, 16 years, I'm approached by 2 Chabad Lubavitchers, which I didn't know was a thing in Kentucky. And they introduced themselves. They're really friendly, asked me where I daven. I explain I'm no longer involved in Judaism. I explain the why. They keep nudging me. Why don't you come over to our father's house and have Shabbos? I push back, just come over. I push back. And eventually one of them, the clever one, the younger one, who may be in this conference right now because I invited him, said to me, fine, don't come for all of Shabbos, just come for Kiddush and cake. And I said, deal. And then as soon as I said it, I was like, wait a second, Kiddush is the first part of Shabbos, and cake is like, with you people, like 3 or 4 hours later. And he's like, but you're a man of your word, aren't you? And I said, yes, I am. He's like, well, then you got to come. And here we are 11 years later. I'm more Jewish than I've ever been. I wouldn't say that I'm more practicing across the board. In some ways I am, but I am very proudly Jewish. I'm overtly Jewish. I wear it on my sleeve. In fact, it's a little bit out of camera. I wear my Mogen David every day. I've got mezuzot on my doors, which I didn't have previously. I am known as the Jew in Frankfurt, but not in a disparaging way. And so I owe that re-engagement to Chabad. And for those who aren't aware, Chabad, they themselves are very frum, and or if people don't know Yiddish, that means highly observant in the practices of Judaism. But in Judaism, we're never supposed to try and convert somebody, not even encourage them. What their mission is to find Jews who are not as engaged with Judaism as they can be, and find a way to connect and engage them. And I would say I'm one of their greatest success stories, because I would have probably continued down the path of not just being secular, but not embracing my Judaism. And here I am still secular, but I wholly embrace my Judaism in everything I do, particularly in my practice as a legislator, that if you go to my social media, Tikkun Olam is all over the place. Whenever I'm looking at a piece of legislation, I look at it through a Jewish lens. And as Daphne will tell you, I attended the National Association of Jewish Legislators meeting at the National Conference of State Legislators National Convention last year, and I'm hoping to get her help to get on the board there. But that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but I have waxed and waned in my engagement. But for the last 11 years that I've been married, I've been highly engaged in a social and political context, and I'll attend some religious stuff, but I am not myself from. I love a raw bar. So for those who don't know, nothing on a raw bar is kosher. My wife is not Jewish, which means that my Chabad friends say that she's my wife according to the laws of Kentucky, which they respect, but according to Jewish law, she's not. We don't have children, and if we did, they would not recognize the children as Jewish, so on and so forth. So
That's
hope I didn't steal my friend Daphna's time, but I
no,
thought
and
that
I'm
was a
going to
good one to
pass it
give my
over to her, and it
perspective.
will be very difficult for me to stay on topic and not get sidetracked by this, because those of you who are joining who know my background, before coming on to the Society for Humanistic Judaism, I worked for an organization called Jewish Outreach Institute for 16 years that focused on issues of engaging interfaith, intermarried households. I am also intermarried and interracially married. My wife is from Japan originally. I run the Japanese Facebook page, and has been a cause, and I continue that at Society for Humanistic Judaism, which I think we have as inclusive and an approach as Chabad does. But our Jews for a Secular Democracy initiative is pluralistic, and we recognize there are multiple approaches. But I will just say, there are today in America more married households with one Jewish and one non-Jewish spouse than there are two Jewish spouses. So intermarried households is the majority of households in America. The Jewish community doesn't feel that way. It does in humanistic Judaism communities. We're overwhelmingly intermarried. I wish the rest of the Jewish community felt that way. I think Chabad's approach is really remarkable for what they do. And your experience of potentially just simply walking away from it has happened to so many people. But steering it back, so many of those people who have walked away from organized Jewish community get involved in organized political action, because the things that drive them to do Tikkun Olam, as you mentioned, are still there. And they're just not doing it with an organized Jewish community, but it still fires them, and it still is driven by their Jewish identity. And it's a shame that we have pushed so many people away. And I'm glad that you did get engaged. I love that kiddush and cake trick. Our services are way shorter, so we wouldn't actually be tricking anybody into it. But anyway,
Paul, if you've ever been to one of their seders, they actually do go until the morning Shema.
Yeah, and my stepbrother is in one of those communities, and he is from, and it's been a really interesting dynamic for my parents, who are openly secular as I am. And that's the beauty of when the Jewish community can be a large and embracing family. They order in from the kosher place, and they eat on paper. And then, my wife is Japanese, and I didn't ask her to convert, and she didn't convert. There is no way she's giving up shellfish for anything, right? In Japan, that's sacrilege in Japan. So anyway, so thank you so much for sharing that. And Daphna, tell us a little bit about your Jewish background.
Well, first of all, Daniel, amazing story. Thank you for sharing it. And if you need help writing that book, you just give me a call, and I'll help you out on that path. So I grew up differently than Daniel. I grew up Orthodox. And I grew up Orthodox in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is the home of Reform Judaism. And something happened in my family when I was 14. And I was going through a lot of stuff, but somebody embarrassed my father outside of synagogue, and my stepfather, cried all the way home. My stepfather was the gabbai, and he made a mistake. Somebody had a yortzeit. He didn't remember. He didn't give them an honor. They yelled at him, said they were going to take away our scholarships from the day school, like really, really laid into my father in front of the congregation. And I became infuriated. And I said, if this is what Orthodox Judaism is, I don't want any part of it. So when I was 14, I the next day went to Roy Rogers and had a bacon and cheese baked potato. Roy Rogers doesn't exist anymore. That's how old I am. And I came home and vomited for 3 days. I am certain that it was more Jewish guilt than it was problem with the bacon and cheese baked potato. But I really was angry, and was angry at Orthodox Judaism, was angry at the people in my community. And my mother said, you know what, it's fine if you don't want to be Orthodox. And it's fine if you don't want to go to yeshiva. Both of my brothers left Cincinnati and went to yeshiva, and I refused. I wanted public school. She said, but you have to join a youth group. And I said, fine. So I joined BBYO because it was non-denominational, and I felt like I could fit in there and I wouldn't have this angry burden of an organized movement that was burdening me. And BBYO was definitely the best thing that ever happened to me. I loved, as the Orthodox Jew, I became Jewish Heritage Vice President, and I was responsible for all of the creative services that we did on Shabbos, which were so amazing. Like, it never occurred to me that I could do poetry on Shabbos, and I could bring in all of these amazing, beautiful non-ritual rituals, and I got to explore all of that through BBYO. On BBYO, I went on March of the Living. It was the second year ever of the March of the Living in 1990. I was 17 years old. And it was a very profound experience for me and my Judaism. Standing in Auschwitz, and just, I was a rock. I couldn't cry, I couldn't feel, I couldn't anything. But I was standing on the place where they tried to end me, where they tried to end my line. And I became very committed to my Judaism. And I mistook that for wanting to be Orthodox. And I went to Yeshiva University for college. So I was at Stern College for Women. And I tried really hard, again, to fit my square peg into that round hole. And I didn't fit. I was a music major. I wanted to sing. And, that's not a place for women in the Orthodox Jewish community, singing. I wanted to be on Broadway. That was my dream and my goal. And I got to practice and study and learn music at Stern and sing and do all of the things. But when I tried to, I got married to a nice Jewish boy from Cincinnati, and we started a family in Colorado, and I tried very hard to fit into the Orthodox community. I was president of the sisterhood. I was all of the things. And when my marriage fell apart, I once again stepped away from the community. And part of that was we had a rabbi who said, we're going to make a list of whose people's houses are kosher enough to eat in. And I was not going to be on that list because my husband was Reform and watched TV on Shabbos, and therefore my house was not kosher enough to eat in. I entertained Friday night, Saturday lunch, and Saturday afternoon before Shabbos was over, every single Shabbos. And now you were saying, I'm not enough. And I exploded again and really struggled and left organized Judaism for quite some time. I met my husband, who is not Jewish, so I fit into the narrative of interfaith households. And when he proposed to me, it was one of the hardest days of my life because I knew I would lose my family. And indeed, when I called my mother and told her I was engaged, the very first thing she said to me was, I'm going to sit Shiva for you. I'm going to mourn your death. And I said to my mother, that's fine, but you don't get to see the grandchildren anymore. She thought about it for half a second, said, never mind, and didn't do that. My grandmother of blessed memory was still living, my father's mother, and told him that under no circumstances was he to separate from me. And ultimately, throughout the years, I have my family is very, very religious. And I have a brother who's kind of the rabbi of the family, if you will. There are many rabbis in my family, but he's the rabbi of the family. And he made it clear that I was to be accepted. And as a result of that, I have a relationship with my family. And as a result of that, I have a real relationship with my Judaism. I do now belong to a congregation, a conservative congregation. But in my legislative world, I have found that the training that I have, the experience and the knowledge that I have in Torah and in Jewish practice and custom, has really benefited me in interesting ways. And you're talking about a secular democracy. When I came into the legislature, this was all, nothing is more important to me than the separation of church and state. And it doesn't exist.
Well, so I'm good. Let's get into the politics, but I do want to acknowledge, I think almost everyone has some kind of painful alienation story about the Jewish community. And it's remarkable that we're all still Jews, when one person in a community can have so much power by giving someone a bad experience and making them feel like they don't have a place in this community. And it's really unfortunate. And I think things have changed. Like I said, I've been working on the issues of inclusion for decades. It has gotten better. It still happens all the time. So I hope people will take from this, from both of you, the message of, words have real power, and let's not push people away. And it's remarkable, in Daniel's case, it was a non-Orthodox rabbi, is my understanding, who said, well, I can't marry you, your kids wouldn't be Jewish. In your case, where your kids would be Jewish according to Orthodoxy, they're still not going to accept you. It's just, there's always a reason, and it's disturbing and upsetting. And I hope that we can be inclusive. And I hope that you can continue to talk about the things you bring with you from your Jewish experience. But I do want to dive into the politics piece, which you mentioned. We're focused on separation of church and state, and it seems very much to be an embattled issue today. We believe that abortion rights, LGBTQ equality, public education are all religious freedom issues, and they're all under siege right now. So as elected state legislators, how do you defend or even define and then defend religious freedom? And then what is the fight for those issues like in your state? And we can go back to Daniel.
Okay, first, I'm going to do a shameless plug. I have never gotten to do March of the Living or anything like that. And I never got to do Birthright because I'm one of the few people on earth who can say that I was rejected from Birthright a few times, because when I was young, yes, and it was still a pilot program, it was much more limited, and I didn't make the cut. And then by the time I made the cut, I was too old. So I've still not been either. And if anyone knows of any organized trip, I'm not wanting to do just a private trip or sign up for a tourist. I want to have that experience with other Jews like me who are, for their first time, embracing the reality of walking through a concentration camp, or the reality of landing at Ben Gurion Airport. And then, of course, I hear how emotional that is, but also going to the Western Wall for the first time. So there's my shameless self-promotion. To answer the question, Kentucky considers religious freedom to be at its foundational core. We are a highly conservative, highly religious state. The most common, first let me say that we are 80-20 in the legislature, 80 Republicans, 20 Democrats. So that shows you the political tilt. But the most common profession of any of my colleagues is not attorney, which it is in most states, it's preacher. And by that, I do mean Southern Baptist or an unaffiliated Protestant denomination similar to Southern Baptist. We have a variety of them. But when they talk about religious freedom, it tends to be their flavor of religious freedom. It's valued when it fits their narrative. So when I talk about how gender affirming care is consistent with Jewish values, that doesn't matter, and they passed the bill to ban gender affirming care. When I talk about how access to reproductive freedom is a Jewish value and that blocking someone's access violates Jewish law, once again, they go ahead and do it, and they don't see the value of religious freedom when it comes to Jewish people. And I can go through many examples, but the ones that you listed, they tend to apply because even an Orthodox Jew would tell you that. They would say that you don't use abortion for birth control, but even the most from Orthodox rabbi would tell you there are a good number of circumstances under which a woman should have an abortion, and that it's not the state's business. Yet our religious freedom is often cast by the wayside. And I know that this session they're coming up with an anti-drag bill, which seems to violate our ability to practice Purim, among other things. But all right, I'm digressing. But there are bills at which they do embrace the religious freedom. So as a freshman in the super duper minority party, it is exceedingly rare that you'll ever get a hearing on one of your bills. But not only am I getting hearings on some of my bills, one of them has been fully embraced by the Republicans, and I think might even get unanimous passage, knock on wood, and I know that's their thing, but I'll pretend knocking on the wood over there. And that's to allow religious freedom for teachers in our school system without consequences. So the law presently says that no public employee can be punished for the free exercise of religion. So if you need to take off for Hanukkah, which you got to be pretty religious to take off for Hanukkah, but more realistically, we're taking off for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Pesach, at least the first and last days. You can take those days without pay, which that means that you're not being punished, but there's no opportunity for you to make up those days. Even if you were to work summer school or freshman orientation day or do in-service training with other teachers, you'll get paid on those days, but those don't count credited towards your retirement. So if you work a 24-year career, which is standard for teachers, even though the law is 26, I'm just using 24 because the math works out a little better, and you miss 5 days a year, that's 120 missed days. That knocks you down an entire day, which means an entire year of service towards retirement. So if you're trying to get up to the 26th year, you actually have to work a 27th year to have a full retirement. But at any stage that you retire, as long as it's been 15 or so years, you're being discredited a year of service. So my bill allows teachers, Jewish or otherwise, but anyone who needs to take off for a religious holiday, to do so and to make up those days of service credit doing things that are extra duties teachers would be paid for anyway. So if you want to do ACT or summer school or any of the other things I mentioned, you're already paid. Now you're not only paid, but that counts back and allows you to make up those missed days of service. If you're from, you might miss 10 days a year, which means that twice the pace you're missing towards retirement. And to my delight, the Republicans have fully embraced this. Yes, they wanted to get an actuarial analysis first to make sure that this wasn't going to be very expensive, to make sure that Jewish teachers and their spouses or Muslim teachers and their spouses are not going to be that it's just not going to be too impactful on the pension system. And the analysis came back that it was negligible because there aren't many of us in Kentucky. Almost everyone is a Christian. But in that case, they were willing to carry the mantle and proudly embrace the religious freedom that they aren't so willing to embrace on those issues where the Republicans tend to be on the offensive on social justice issues. Lastly, I would point out that this is also an opportunity for me to demonstrate to my Republican colleagues the reality of institutional bias. I don't think when anyone developed the teacher retirement system, anyone said, let's make sure to make things unfair for non-Christians. They just wanted to have a fair system across the board, and they defined service days as days that school is in session. And the other days can be paid days, but those aren't service days because they don't want you banking extra days by working summer school and retiring early. That I get. But because there was no Jewish, no Muslim, no Hindu, no non-Christian person involved in the conversation, unintentionally, they developed a system that does punish you if you're not Christian. And my colleagues are getting that. And I'm trying to use that little crack in the window to open it up further so they can acknowledge that there are other biases out there that, once again, may not be intentional. But when we, as progressives, speak about institutional bias or institutional racism is the more common phrase, It doesn't mean that someone sat down and said, let's make a system that harms Black people. But if Black people weren't there developing the system, you know, the old expression, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that frankly often happens. And I know I said last thing, but real quick, the Kentucky State Police were exposed about 2 years ago for using actual Nazi materials in their police training, that they were quoting Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels translated into English. And even when they were caught, they didn't think that it was such a big deal because they thought that the quotes were really effective at the value of having good police authority and being feared rather than respected, so on and so forth. That's been largely cleaned up, but that's yet another example that I can use with my colleagues that maybe someone, probably someone at the Kentucky State Police training decided to embrace that, but there was no one there to say, hey, these quotes sound familiar. Let's find out where they're from and have that conversation. And that's the value of pluralism. You know, I'm going to always seize those opportunities. And that's a perfect example of me who doesn't take days off for Jewish holidays to still be Jewish in these spaces and advocate for Jews and all other non-Christians.
That's great. And your bio said, but just to confirm, you are the only Jewish state rep or Jewish state legislator?
We have a Jewish state senator who is even less observant than I am, but is by any and every definition Jewish. We also have a new state rep who just got sworn in last month in a special election because a friend of mine passed away suddenly at only aged 45. She is halakhically Jewish, but is a practicing Presbyterian. But I nudge her and remind her that she's still Jewish because, God forbid, she'll be on the same boxcar with us. So I'm trying to get her to embrace her Jewishness more, not make her more observant because that's not her thing, but to share these spaces with me and stand up for the voiceless who have not been in the room before.
Well, she's got Jewish family, you know, however she identifies, she has Jewish family.
Correct.
That's right. What are you seeing, Daphna? What's your experience been?
So my experience is different than Daniel's in that we have a Democratic supermajority in the House, and we're one shy of a Democratic supermajority in the Senate.
You want to trade?
No, thank you. So when I came into the legislature 7 years ago, the very first day I walked in, you know, I'm this young nubile legislator, like I know nothing, and I see all of these people wearing pins with the Colorado flag, the American flag, and the Israeli flag, and I'm like, wow, what is this support for Israel? This is wild. And I didn't really understand the evangelical movement's support of Israel, why they support Israel, all of this stuff. And I didn't know it existed. So, you know, I'm talking to some of these legislators with the pins on, and we start the session and we go to announcements. And one of these guys that I had been talking to, was wearing the pin, comes down and invites everybody to Bible study. And I was like, Bible study? And they said, yeah, it's open to everybody. And it takes place in one of the committee rooms in the basement every Tuesday morning. And I'm like, Bible study in a committee room every Tuesday morning? I was too intrigued not to attend. And, you know, there were lots of feelings. One is like, obviously there's no separation of church and state. Also, we start, you know, we have a prayer every morning, like,
and it's always in Jesus' name because we have it as well. Well,
they're not supposed to say in Jesus' name in Colorado, but they do. It's supposed to be pluralistic in Colorado, but it is not. Sometimes it is, but many times it is not. And I start going to the Bible study because I'm like, all right, if I believe in Tikkun Olam, which I do, and if my values were built on the Torah, maybe their values are built on the Bible too, and maybe we could have a common language. So I start going to Bible study. He said it was open to everybody. So I'm like, open to everybody. They have to be studying the Torah because that's open to everybody. And they were studying something called 2 Timothy. And I had no idea who Timothy was, let alone that there were two of him. And, just this whole kind of entrance into this world of what they consider the Bible, the New Testament. And we're having values-based talks, and I'm saying, let me show you where this is in the Torah. Let me show you where this comes from here. And let me show you, which I was so thankful that I had such a strong education in Torah that I was able to help make these connections for them. And I would see them talk about values such as feeding children. And then when I would bring a bill forward to make reduced price lunch free, they would vote against it. And I wouldn't understand where the values were stripped from them as soon as they walked through the doors of the legislature, of the chamber. And I still kept going to Bible study. And one day, the same guy who made the announcement about Bible study literally walks across the aisle, comes to my chair and says, Daphna, I don't understand. If you are such a believer, and I don't know what he thinks I believe in, but okay, if you are such a believer, how is it that you support abortion? And I said, abortion is not against Jewish law. It is always the health of the mother that comes first. And that could be the physical, that could be the emotional, but whatever it is always the health of the mother that comes first. And he was just stunned. I don't think he ever considered that abortion is not against the Torah. And, that was a really big moment for me, because I felt like, oh my God, I just had a conversation about abortion with one of the most right-wing evangelical members of the House, where he was speechless. He didn't have anything to come back with. Did that change his perception? Absolutely not. But it opened the opportunity for a conversation. Now, fast forward a couple of months more into the legislature, that legislative session, and there was a memorial that happened. And this memorial, when we do memorials for former legislators, we are legally in session. So that means the public is watching, the public is listening, and we are on the record. And long story short, at a point in the memorial, one of the legislators who was leading the memorial said, I'm going to do what Steve did. And she started pounding on the dais, and she said, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And then she invited the entire chamber to join her. And the entire chamber broke out into Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And I'm sitting there like really feeling Jewish, like I never felt Jewish before. And they start passing out pins about yay big that said Jesus, Jesus, Jesus in little baskets, like they pass around the collection bin at church. And I'm like, what on earth is going on here? And this is during session. And I was brand new, and I sat there and I was frozen. I didn't know what, this was that quintessential question that you asked in BBYO all the time. Are you an American who just happens to be Jewish, or are you a Jewish American? Right? And that was that moment for me. Am I a legislator that just happens to be Jewish, or am I a Jewish legislator? And I decided, after reaching out to the Anti-Defamation League, after reaching out to several rabbis, and spreading my wings a little bit with this experience, that I needed to take a moment of personal privilege and point out what happened in that room. And I know that the evangelicals love when I talk Hebrew. So I get up in front of the room and I start with V'ahavta l'reach kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, and start talking about how that experience in this space that is supposed to be open and available and comfortable for anybody, no matter their race or religion. And we are shouting the name of one God. We are giving a message that we are all under this belief.
Right.
And that we are not paying attention to our neighbor. And I ended with saying, I am your neighbor. Well, the attack ads started coming out within 20 minutes. Picture of me with my pink hat from the Women's March, saying, meet Representative Daphna Michaelson-Janae. She doesn't feel comfortable hearing the name Jesus from the well. Call her and tell her what you think.
So that really touches on what I also wanted to ask about, which we name as white Christian nationalism. And we've been talking about this for several years. And when we first started, the phrase itself was almost never seen in the organized Jewish community or like in the Forward Jewish newspaper, and now it is much more recognized as a phenomenon. And of course, every time we mention it, we say we're not talking about all Christians, and we're not even necessarily talking about a majority of Christians. And the experiences that you're describing could be someone who just genuinely doesn't know, who just genuinely grew up in a culture of Christian privilege without even knowing it, and just presumes everyone wants to shout Jesus, 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 right? But the issue is then when you tell them that's not my lived experience, that's not who I am, that makes me feel excluded from the American experience. It's not supposed to be this way. Here's our Constitution. And they still do it, right? Then they hear you and don't care, or they want to rule by minority, which is what it would be, because it's not just minorities like Jews. Most Christians, and I wanted to ask Daniel a bit about the, there was a referendum, I believe, or a ballot initiative in Kentucky around putting an anti-abortion clause in your Constitution that was rejected by voters. So even though you're saying 80% of your legislature represents a certain viewpoint, when it was given to the voters themselves, they rejected it. So it is, to us, we fear an attempt to rule by minority, which is undemocratic, by a minority group who sees their religion as that should be the guiding force for all of Americans. So what has your experience, you're touching on some of your experiences, but I want to kind of name it as white Christian nationalism, and how does that come up, and how are you experiencing it or addressing it?
Well, I can say, and I'm not going to name names, you can do a little Googling yourself. I do have overt white Christian nationalists in the legislature with me who don't deny that they want a Christo-fascist rule, not just in Kentucky, but throughout the entire United States, where I'll let your imagination go wild, but the worst of the worst of the worst, back to bringing in racial separation, stripping women of not just reproductive freedom, but the rights to control their own finances or have employment or be out in public without men's permission, that church attendance would have primacy and be mandatory, where any social issue that has a judgment in the evangelical context, that would be the law. Books and media that don't conform would be banned, and they're slowly creeping there one way or the other. But I mean, it's an everyday reality for me, and I have not had the exact same experience as Daphna with the Jesus, 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 but I can tell you that every day they open with a prayer, and 9 out of 10 times Jesus's name is mentioned at least 2 or 3 times, and often they do it in committees. And there's just this assumption that we're all there, but as you pointed out, Paul, we're not. When the Republicans put the ballot initiative on to have a constitutional prohibition to abortion, which, by the way, we already have a statutory prohibition, and our statutory prohibitions are even stricter than Texas, but they didn't think that went far enough, so they wanted to put it on the ballot to make a constitutional amendment, and it spectacularly backfired. In fact, a majority, not just of the public, but a majority of House seats voted to reject the constitutional amendment. And there were people like myself who were begging and pleading my party, and I know this is not supposed to be a partisan talk, but I've got it just pointed out, begging them to hitch their wagon to vote no on 2. They declined to do so. Vote no on 2, kicked butt across the state, and my party got 20 of the 100 seats because they were afraid to embrace the rejection. I know that sounds like a double negative, but they were afraid to embrace the rejection of this white Christian nationalism. And that's where people are. People don't want that. Almost every issue, when you talk to voters, is a typical kitchen table issue. And you'll find that people are willing to, unfortunately, and you saw it with Trump, to forgive a lot of extremism if the right kitchen table issues are being discussed. But I would say that reproductive freedom is a kitchen table issue. If you don't know a woman who has had to have an abortion for health, for having been sexually assaulted, for a non-viable fetus, and so many other reasons, then you just don't know many women, because it is a high number. Forgive me, I don't remember the statistics, but it's a very large number of women that at some point will have to have an abortion. And I think the awareness of that is why people were not outwardly shouting in favor of protecting reproductive freedom here in Kentucky, but still overwhelmingly voted in favor of rejecting the constitutional amendment. And that is a double negative, but that one had to be there because we're not the ones who put it up. And I think the Republicans will avoid making that mistake again. And frankly, if I had my way, and you need to have a majority to get it through the General Assembly to then make the ballot initiative, I would do the opposite. I would have a ballot initiative that codifies in Kentucky's Constitution a right to an abortion. And I know that it would pass, which is why my colleagues won't let us have the vote to then put it on the ballot.
And it is passing in states that are seen as battleground states like Ohio, and they're gearing up to do it in Florida, where they need a 60% threshold. Ohio needed 50%. So I think they have a good chance in Florida to do it as well. And that's, you know, a pretty remarkable thing. And to me, it really speaks to the undemocratic nature of what's trying to be done, because when it is open up in a democratic way to the voters, they want abortion access, you know, most with some kind of restrictions, but not to be as totally illegal as what we're seeing, you know. And this week it was someone having to literally flee Texas for her life.
And is being prosecuted by the Attorney General on multiple felony charges. Like the level of unconscionableness.
Yeah, and that's why when we say white Christian nationalism, we always point out this is not all Christians, not even the majority of Christians. I know many Christians who are horrified what's being done in the name of their religion. How about in Colorado? What are you seeing with white Christian nationalism?
Well, I mean, my story shares what their goal is, and that is to have everybody follow Jesus. And they are not quiet about it. They often talk about Christians as the most persecuted people on earth. And it's very overwhelming. But somebody asked in the thing, we have a Jewish governor in Colorado, and we have a Jewish attorney general. We also happen to have a Jewish secretary of state. The only executive branch leader that is not Jewish is the state treasurer. Let's laugh about
irony.
That. But his name is very Jewish, so that holds water. But you know, how are people dealing with that? How are people dealing with the fact that there's a Jewish governor and that there's Jewish leadership? And quite frankly, we don't hear, or I don't hear, a tremendous amount of backlash from it. I will say that this governor has needed more protections than any other governor, but he's also our first openly gay governor. So there's, you know, he's got multiple things going for him. Our attorney general is beloved throughout the state. He lives every day as if he's on the campaign trail, and he, you know, knows everybody's name and knows everybody's issues and is working on them all. And so it has been somewhat good, but we often try not to remind people that they're Jewish. I'm legitimately, when we talk about it in groups, we don't kind of bring up that the governor's Jewish. We don't kind of bring up that the attorney general's Jewish. We never bring up that the secretary of state is Jewish, because she's kind of Jewish, but she's Jewish, you know? And it's scary for us in the Jewish community. So the governor is often asked, are you gay first or Jewish first? And his response is, it depends on the audience, every single time. And he faces questions that no other governor has faced before. But the fact that we got him elected, and not only got him elected once, but got him elected twice, was a really big deal in Colorado. So, I think as far as white nationalism is concerned, it exists, and it exists in our legislature, it exists in our state house, it exists in our state senate, but it doesn't exist in our executive branch at the moment. And that's a huge win.
I wish that it were Colorado levels, I can tell you, because I have colleagues who say anti-Semitic things on the record, in hearings, on the House floor. For example, one of them claimed that the abortion pill was invented by Jews who learned how to get rich with mass genocide from the Holocaust, but it's okay because the Jews are benefiting from it now, in a very sarcastic tone. I have a colleague who the ban on trans healthcare, this is just leaning back into the white nationalism, the ban on trans healthcare isn't enough. He actually wants the children eradicated. I mean, like, the levels of extremism in Kentucky will shock you. The only thing I think you one-upping me on is the Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. That hasn't happened to us yet. But
it's scary, and there is this weird thing in evangelical Christianity that is like a philo-Semitism that overlaps with an anti-Semitism, about them, because they know that their religion emerged out of Judaism. So it's just this very odd relationship.
That is a beautiful way of phrasing it, because I have colleagues who, at the same time that they tell me that they're praying for me every day to find Jesus and say some of the most anti-Semitic things on a regular basis, are the first ones to come to my defense when a pro-Hamas, and I don't mean pro-ceasefire, there's a difference, a pro-Hamas person comes at me. Those right-wing anti-Semites are the first ones to come to my defense. Yeah.
And that's a very also complicated relationship. And, part of the theology behind some folks is that all Jews need to go back to Israel for Jesus to come back. So there is, like, in their own odd theology, again, not shared by most Christians, but, circulated in these groups of folks. That's part of it. So they're all gung-ho about Israel, and they kind of wish we would just go there. And they're,
I had one offer that. One of them told me that in their church, they had a conversation and I was brought up, and that they're offering to pay my expenses. And it was said with genuine love, not hatred, but like, my church would like to sponsor sending you and your wife to Israel so you can live there to fulfill the prophecy of the coming of Jesus.
And that kind of, so one of the questions in the chat is, and I think you're kind of speaking to it and giving the answer, but it's like, when you bring up the First Amendment, which seems pretty clear about not having an established religion favored over all other religions, or no religion by our country, does it just fall on deaf ears?
I think worse than falling on deaf ears, it falls on combative ears that say we've always been a Christian nation, and we started as a Christian nation, and of course this means that we're supposed to be a Christian nation. That's at least in Colorado. What are you hearing, Daniel?
I would say the same thing, that ironically they are flexible on the First Amendment because they openly support an establishment of religion as long as it's their religion. But when it comes to the Second Amendment, they are as uncompromising as one could possibly be. And I'm actually looking, there it is, to show you something. So this is, and I'm gonna try and hold it up because I don't know if I have screen control, but let's see if I can get it. This is by the metal detectors on the entrance to the Capitol. So you can bring your firearms, You just have to properly holster them. And if you're bringing an assault rifle, you have to have it muzzle up. So I'm almost speechless, but this is a real photo that I show to people all the time. So they will not compromise on the Second Amendment. And I'll reiterate, you can bring assault rifles into the Capitol building as long as it's muzzle up, because otherwise you're infringing on someone's Second Amendment rights. But me politely asking, can we tone down the Jesus talk, is an absolute no-go, because they don't believe in the First Amendment and openly and willfully support an establishment of religion as long as it's their religion.
It's scary and terrifying, but I do want to kind of hopefully end on a hopeful note, because there's much to fear. One of the things I find hopeful is that when you look at polls of younger generations, I mean, I'm a secularist, so, this may not be good news for folks who are religious, but the folks we're talking with are liberal-minded religious people too, that's growing. And this fundamentalism you can track as being part of an older generation. And the younger people, LGBTQ equality is much less of an issue among younger people. Abortion rights and abortion access seems to be much less of an issue among younger people. They may not vote as much as we want them to yet, but are you seeing that? Are you finding that there is a generational thing? And are you hopeful that maybe these issues are generational and we can look for something hopeful in the future? Or where do you find hope is the question.
Daphne, would you go first?
Do you find hope? The younger generation is very, very interesting, and I think they are still finding themselves. So I don't know that I can claim that they're not going to follow in the footsteps of their predecessors. But I find hope in the fact that member who I told you about crossed the aisle to come and ask me about abortion. There is possibility in building conversational relationships. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes dedication, and it takes sitting through a lot of anti-Semitic comments and jokes and, oh, I was just kidding. It takes sitting through a lot of that, but a conversation can be opened. Did I change Jim Wilson's mind? I did not change Jim Wilson's mind, I can guarantee you, but I put a worm in there that he will never be able to remove. And that's only because he opened the door for me to have the conversation. So that's where I find my hope.
I'm going to give basically 3 answers, blending things. First is I share that same kind of hope with my colleagues. And for many of them, they've told me I'm the first Jew that they've ever known. And some of them tell me I'm the second Jew, the other being a Chabad rabbi, the same one that I told you about who coaxed me in with Kiddush and cake, who regularly comes to the Capitol. And to an overt anti-Semite, I look Jewish. To an average person on the street, I don't. He wears the black hat and the black suit with the white shirt. Like, you don't need to, he's not just Jewish, but he's a Hasidic Jew and he's a rabbi. And so they're seeing a contrast and learning so much about Judaism just between the two of us. And that opens the door to those conversations. I have great working relationships with the Republicans, despite being super duper liberal. And some of it is tokenism that they tell me, and I've asked, why are you so nice to me? And some of them have said, because I learned growing up that you should always be kind to the Jews because the Lord blesses those who bless the people of Israel. And I'm not going to like a gift horse in the mouth. So if they want to be extra nice to me, they can be extra nice. But as for the generational question, on almost every social justice issue, generationally, it has gotten far more progressive. And I am very supportive and very hopeful of the younger generations, with the exception of that study that just came out last week, that each successive generation is becoming more denialist of the Holocaust and more anti-Semitic. And I think it was Wall Street Journal, if not, it was something of that stature that showed something like 70% of people under 30 think the Holocaust was either fabricated or, quote, greatly exaggerated. And it's not surprising that there's then a parallel with other forms of anti-Semitism, because it's core to our identity. Even if you are a Sephardic Jew or a Mizrahi Jew or an Ethiopian Jew, the Holocaust still is core to your identity. And the moment people start denying that, they're denying the essence of modern Jewry, the way that, you can't be a Christian and not believe that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary and that he lived a perfect life and died on the cross for everyone's sins and rose from the dead. I mean, you might be practicing Christianity, but you are not a Christian, in the same way that you are not a Jew in the 20th or now 21st century if you don't carry that awareness that 2/3 of European Jews were exterminated in a 5-year period. If you don't carry with you the awareness that 80 years later, we're still not back up to the population we were before that act, that 80 years later, there are still people calling for that extermination. And we saw people doing that on October 7th and since October 7th. So although I maintain a great deal of hope on social justice issues, I am terrified for the future of the Jewish people if we can't raise awareness through education and interaction and turn the growing tide of anti-Semitism, largely based upon the Holocaust denialism, which then feeds into de-justifying and or de-legitimizing the existence of the state of Israel. So then I said there was a third thing, which there was a question much earlier. I think it was from someone named Jackie. Let me see if I can find it real quick, where she asked, well, I'm not finding it, but I remember the question was about other movements that we've been involved with, like Black Lives Matter, which seem to have broken away from us. And I think that's connected. And I remember during the Black Lives Matter movement, and I did march with Black Lives Matter, and I got tear gas because of it. And hold on one second. This is relevant, I promise.
Fighting disinformation.
As I say that, I
Deal
can't
with
find
it.
it. I thought I had my rubber bullets right there in that
Oh,
drawer.
wow.
They weren't. But I still saved the rubber bullets and the tear gas canisters, which I was never hit with one, but you can pick them up off the ground. And I don't regret it for a second. But at that time, there were more conservative Jews, typically older ones, who were saying that we should not be part of this movement because they're not with us. They will never be with us. If you look at their charter is anti-Semitic. They would remind us of all the Jewish people did in the 50s and particularly the 60s, but then even the 70s and 80s, marching for social justice and representing on civil rights cases and saying that the favor's never been returned. And I found contempt in those statements. And I told them that we did it, and I was not alive in the 50s and 60s, but we did it because it was the right thing and we should do it all over again. And I say the same thing with Black Lives Matter. It pains my heart to watch them turn on us and say and do some of the most anti-Semitic things that I've ever seen, but it was the right thing to do in and of itself. And we should not back away from doing the right things. But we clearly need to do better engagement. We clearly need to do a lot more to improve our image. But I'm going to show you a Black Lives Matter affiliated organizations event. And sorry about the highlighted word, but I had to do a word search on my phone to find it. There was a Remove Genocide Profiteers from Our Neighborhoods community canvas here in Louisville just a month ago. And the lighting's a little bad, but there you go. Community canvas and outreach. So remove genocide profiteers.
And you can see the shape of Israel and
yeah, it's a solid Palestine with not West Bank and Gaza, but they weren't talking about removing them from the neighborhoods in Israel.
Yeah,
they meant it here in Louisville, and their launching point just happened to be a church that was in the middle of the only Jewish neighborhood, not in my district, by the way, in all of Kentucky. So a stone's throw from 3 synagogues. Now, luckily, the event fell flat. And we didn't publicize it beforehand because what they wanted is they wanted a counter protest and they wanted the media attention. But from witnesses, these are the same people that we marched with 2 years ago when or 3 years ago now, Breonna Taylor was killed here in Louisville. And we were one of the most explosive cities for Black Lives Matter. These are the same people that we locked arms with when Yahya was killed during the protests of the Breonna Taylor killing. And it's heartbreaking, but I've said it before and I'm saying it to an audience with the recording. I don't regret doing it for a second. And if I could do it all over again, I would, because it's the right thing to do in and of itself. But we need to foster more relationships and not just do it, but do it and tell everyone the reason I'm doing this is because of my Jewish values, not just I'm here with you and I happen to be Jewish. Because when people hear that, when we lean into it, they'll have a better understanding of who we are and what we're about. And hopefully in the future, we won't be standing alone.
Thank you. There needs to be so much more outreach and also a lot of countering of disinformation. And that's something that I think we will take up as a topic for future webinars, because that's really essential, obviously. And maybe we were caught unawares of the work that we weren't doing in those areas when October 7th happened. But I want to thank you both. I think everyone who's joined us is so thankful and thrilled that you are representing us as a people and as a community and as American citizens. And I really appreciate your thoughtful answers and your generosity of time for being with us today. And we look forward to following your work and your progress as you move forward and continue to defend the First Amendment freedoms that we, no longer take for granted. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Honored to be here and honored to share the stage with my friend from Colorado, who it's only been 4 months since I've seen you. So come on to Louisville and come visit. Speaking of which, next year, the convention's in my city. So come on.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you again. And thanks for everybody who joined us. Have a great day. Take care.
Bye-bye.